Okay, this is Ron, and I'll be starting the discussion, and then we'll turn to Richard. Thank you all for being here today and wanting to learn more about the Chloe 2 report and our plans for Chloe. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors as well, our platinum sponsor, iDesign, and our gold sponsor, Extension Engine, for their support of the second Chloe report. The report covers a wide range of topics, and I urge anyone who's listening who hasn't downloaded the full report to do so. And we can only really cover a relatively small number of topics in the next hour. So please do download the full report from either Eduventures site or Quality Matters site, and that's a free download. Today we are going to focus on some aspects of the strategic positioning of online programs. Some questions related to the organization, design, and innovation of online learning, and then some preview of our plans for the third Chloe survey. But to start with, I'd like to give a little bit of background to those of you who aren't too familiar with Chloe. It stands for the Changing Landscape of Online Education, and it's a partnership between the higher ed research firm Eduventures and Quality Matters. It is based on an annual survey of chief online officers, and I'll be saying more later on about who these folks are. We had 182 institutions responding in Chloe 2, and we're hoping to increase that, and we want to encourage those of you who represent institutions that are not currently involved with the survey to try to get your chief online officer or the equivalent to contact us and participate in the next survey. You can see here the range of topics that we cover, and as I say, we'll only be able to dip into a few topics in this event. Okay, my cursor seems to be giving me trouble too. Yeah, okay, well, I think I've got an alternative now. What is the justification for yet another survey? Why Chloe? Well, it stems from conversations between Quality Matters and Eduventures, and we found some substantial grounds of agreement on the need for further study. For one thing, online learning continues to expand, although there's some question as to how long that trend will continue. And perhaps more significantly, it's gaining ground year by year in mainstream higher education. And the mainstream status puts a new perspective on a range of issues, from the management and budgeting of online programs to the infrastructure to support them, the technology and pedagogy, policy, and strategic planning for the future. And so we felt that these were not issues that were being adequately addressed by existing surveys. So we joined forces to look at these impacts, the impact of these elements on online learning through a unique survey. Ultimately, we want to provide perspectives on each segment within the higher ed community to follow trends over time on these issues and to develop some alternative models of success and organization of online programs. So those are things we're doing now and looking for in the future. I have used the word mainstream as an essential element of our view, and I probably should define that a bit more. To be considered mainstream, online learning needs to be an integral part of an institution. It's no longer experimental, an ad hoc initiative that has to seek special funding year by year. It's part of the regular budgeting process. It has a seat at the table when important institutional as well as online learning issues are being discussed. And it pulls together a number of issues that are essential to the success of online learning. One reflection of this is the emergence of the chief online officer, who's an advocate for online learning and who has access to the various components that are important to work together toward a positive outcome online. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Richard to take us through some of the demographics and other elements in the survey.
Thank you, Ron. This is Richard Garrett, Chief Research Officer at Eduventures. We're delighted to be Quality Matters partner in this initiative. What I'd like to do on this slide is just orient you to our CLOE 2017 sample, the sample upon which our most recent report that came out earlier this month is based. You can see that we had responses from a wide range of institutional types, but more so on the nonprofit side than the for-profit side. So public 2-year, public 4-year, and private 4-year, we had significant number of responses, and that increased nicely from the first CLOE survey. For profits, we had a smattering of responses, but by no means representative. And for CLOE 3, as Ron will mention later on, we're making a particular effort to try and grow that for-profit sample, given the significance of for-profit schools historically in the development of online higher education. So we were delighted to get a nice bump from 104 to 182 responses, 75% growth between CLOE 1 and CLOE 2. But we know we have a long way to go and many more schools to appeal to if CLOE is to become truly representative. Next slide, please, Ron. So what I'm going to do now before we get into some selected findings from CLOE 2 is just to highlight a couple of pieces of context that help us understand the setting for CLOE and some of the data points we're going to share with you. Next slide. First is the question of enrollment. The words online learning and growth are often used in the same sentence. We've become accustomed to online growing regardless of the state of the economy or other variables. But online is now 2+ decades old. It's getting to the stage that it is subject to broader social forces, economic forces. And one question we have to ask that bears on our interest in the work of CLOE is, at what point might the online market stabilize or even start to go into reverse in terms of enrollment? And one trend that interests us, and this isn't CLOE data, this is federal data, is looking at online enrollment growth versus online program growth. And here we're using the distance exclusive categorization used in the federal IPED system. And you can see, excuse me, you can see for the 4 years where we have growth data at federal level that that blue bar enrollment growth year over year has been outpaced every year by online program growth. That first Fall 2013, jump of 34%, I think is an exaggeration. It reflects schools figuring out what to report, how to report, following the introduction of the mandate to include and segment distance or online students in annual reporting. But even subsequent to that, as the reporting settled down, we continue to see program growth outpacing enrollment growth. And what does that tell us? Does that risk market saturation in some fields or some geographies? Does it suggest the need for schools to differentiate the nature of their online programming, not simply thinking of online in and of itself as the solution, as the differentiator? This all speaks to our rationale for Chloe, thinking about how schools strategize around online learning. What problems are they trying to solve? How are they organizing themselves to get the most from online learning? And how is the pedagogy technology combination that online learning embodies starting to diverge and differentiate? And how do we think about impact and efficacy from a student experience point of view, outcomes point of view, and then ultimately institutional direction and brand? Next slide, please. So on that point of online outcomes, I think this is another emerging trend. We're used to thinking of online learning being judged in terms of how fast it's growing on the front end, how many students are enrolling. We know a lot less about how many students are persisting or graduating or what they then go on to do. And we still don't have great data there, but through iPads now, we are beginning to get much more color on what's going on. So as many people know, in recent years, iPads has started to include graduation rates for non-traditional undergraduates, so part-time students or students who enrolled in the past, dropped out, and have now re-enrolled. That used to be silent when it came to federal data, but now we have all of that detail. What we don't yet have is this data broken out by delivery mode across all schools. We know that schools of all shapes and sizes now offer online programs, but the only online students we can isolate in the data at the moment are those that attend fully distance or fully online institutions, which are a significant subset, but by no means characterize the whole market. So what you're seeing on this slide is federal data showing average completion rates or graduation rates, 8-year graduation rates, allowing for a slower pace for part-time students, and comparing the overall average, all delivery modes for public 4-year, private 4-year, for profits, and so on. And then the fully distance schools, the green line. And you can see, again, this is an average, so it doesn't reflect the performance of every school, but for first-time full-time, for first-time part-time, for non-first-time part-time students, the distance schools are lagging the pace rather than showing average performance or superior performance. And that to us is a stimulus to think about, how do we judge online learning at this stage of its development? We need to move beyond just counting students and starting to think about longer term impact. Is it helping non-traditional students emerge successfully out of the other end, not just engage in a convenient, flexible delivery mode? Can online learning enable U.S. higher education to elevate its performance rather than just expand access to a broader range of institutions? So again, Chloe's interested in how schools are beginning to think more critically, more strategically about the value that online learning can bring to the big challenges that face higher ed, not just access, but also quality, cost, and outcomes. Next slide. So let's get into some of the Chloe data. As Ron said, there's a lot more detail in the report, so if you haven't read it, we encourage you to do so. I'm going to talk about 3 issues: questions of competition, program growth, and related matters. So on this slide, you can see the competitive question. In the first Chloe survey, we asked schools to give their sense of relative competition in the online market over time. And the overwhelming response was the market has become a lot more competitive. This time around, we added a follow-up question, trying to get some color on what did they mean by competition? Where was it coming from? So here you can see the top table on this chart when we think about competition in terms of location of the competitor, you can see that for public two-year institutions, competition is most keenly felt locally, nearby institutions, reflecting the local characteristic of a community college, but also seeing programs and schools from outside that locality and even across the nation starting to show up as relevant competitors that naturally wouldn't be the case historically for a place-bound, campus-based notion of a two-year school. If we then go on to the four-year schools, you see significant local competition, but more activity at the regional and at the national level, reflecting the diversity of institutions and missions in those categories. The second half of the slide, we're focusing on institutional type in terms of online competition. So for public institutions, 2 and 4 year, it's other public institutions that are seen as competitive threats in some sense, or more competitively visible, and other kinds of institution much less significant. And that may reflect price point, subsidies for in-state students, and so on. And the fact that many adults still prioritize local schools rather than truly embracing the full array of choices they might through an online modality. Whereas private nonprofit four-year schools, a very diverse group of institutions, we're seeing, again, more competition from immediate peers, but also public institutions looking for that same business, perhaps undercutting on price. And it's striking along the bottom that for-profits were least likely to be cited in all circumstances by all institutional types involved in CLOE, which suggests, or which reflects the decline in fortunes of that sector. For-profits pioneered, in most cases, scaled online programming in the United States, but many nonprofits now have followed suit and can often outcompete in terms of local brand, national brand reputation, and for-profits are not the threat they once were. But as we'll come on to, it doesn't mean that for-profits won't return invigorated with new ideas and present a new challenge. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier on, we're very interested through CLOE in this question of enrollment growth versus program growth. What's the optimal number of online programs given a certain institutional type, mission, and set of objectives around online learning? So we asked institutions, how many programs do you have now? And we can also get that from federal data, but we have a more up-to-date number through CLOE. And then we also ask, how many online programs are you planning to launch in the next few years? And you can see here, there's a variety of circumstances and aspiration. The most common response at all stages or all scales of online programming today is to launch fewer than 5 new online programs in the next little while. And that reflects, I think, the relative maturity of many online program portfolios. But one striking trend is that the schools today with the largest number of online programs, those at the top with more than 20 today, are most likely to plan to launch more than 10 or more than 5 in the coming years. So we have this potential trade-off between a few schools that see online as a way of breaking out of geographical confines, transforming their brand perhaps, or extending their brand more easily by geography, and trying to turn biggest into best online. And then you have the bulk of schools that I think increasingly recognize that their online future may be leveraging online as a way to hold on to, expand locally, to offer a new way to serve local markets and audiences, to perhaps combine online learning and on-campus learning in new, creative, engaging ways. And therefore, it's less about lots and lots of new programs that demand significant enrollment scale out of the ordinary, and more about attuning online learning to a common, consistent mission. We also asked about motives for program expansion. Why do schools want to expand? And again, increased online enrollment emerged most strongly across all the 4 sectors that you see on this slide. Just this idea of we want more students. But is that a desire to expand remit? Is it simply trying to shore up enrollment weaknesses elsewhere which may be a smart strategy, but assumes that online can accommodate more and more programs, as opposed to being there. Is there going to be a point in time not too long in the future when there's oversaturation in certain geographies or certain disciplines? Other motivations were there, but less commonly cited. Revenue or profit was less of a motivation, which I think speaks to questions of access over financial return, or confusion about return on investment financially for the school versus a clear sense in which online learning has been finessed to produce a certain margin that might be seen as superior to other modalities. Diversity of online offerings is there too, but not as strong as that overall desire to push overall enrollment. And next slide, Ron. And then this question of fully online versus blended. We're intrigued whether schools see online learning as the best fit for certain populations, working adults, for example, who need the flexibility that fully online learning embodies, or whether they start to worry that fully online detaches the student from the school in problematic ways and implies that co-location of student and institution isn't particularly important pedagogically, and whether some sort of blend might be the best way to domesticate online learning and make it work for the institution as a whole, given that most institutions are place-bound, campus-based institutions, as opposed to going off on a tangent that may or may not support the core operation. So we asked schools, both for courses and programs, what's the balance between fully online, blended, and then shades in between. And for both courses and programs, we found fully online was the go-to in the majority of cases. There was certainly variation by academic department, reflecting the fact that at many schools there isn't much of a top-down approach to online learning. It's much more bottom-up. And then few schools really standing out and saying we deliberately blend courses, or we deliberately blend programs. That's our strategy, rather than it's fully online or it's fully on ground. So again, is this a reflection of student demand? Is it simply schools late to the online market imitating those that were earlier movers? And is that smart, or is that does that risk commodification and not getting the same return? And is there more need for creative emphasis on blended learning, not least because of the literature in this field going back over 10 years now, and arguably longer, that tends to find that some sort of blend of online and on ground emerges as better in some sense, whether it's satisfaction, engagement, student outcomes, and performance. And yet the way schools are investing, at least at program level, doesn't seem to reflect that. But equally, it's hard to track and capture blended learning, given that it occupies this broad no man's land between fully online and fully on ground. And we perhaps don't yet have the terminology and the tools to capture that richness. But on the face of this data in Chloe, there does seem to be a bit of a tension between what the literature suggests is most effective and where most schools are investing. Next slide, Ron. I think over to you now.
Yes. Now we're going to turn to some issues related to the management and course design, and then finally innovation in online learning. One factor that we have been looking at in both Chloe 1 and Chloe 2 is whether institutions are centralizing the management of online support services and other functions, or are distributing those functions among different sectors or different structures of the institution. And there was some movement between Chloe 1 and Chloe 2 in the numbers as we expanded our reach. At this point, you can see that there's a modest tilt towards centralizing those activities. About 45% of the respondents indicated that their their programs were more centralized, and only about 25% described or characterized them as being more distributed in terms of the various functions in the institution. Of course, the largest single group, though, is still identified as blended. And what we really think is going on here is a gradual adjustment to the demands of online learning. And I would speculate that we'll be moving toward greater centralization for its efficiency in all aspects other than the academic programming and curriculum issues themselves. But time will tell. Connected to this is the role of the Chief Online Officer. Many titles are used in practice, but we're beginning to see a clustering of activities around one individual or one office within an institution to make online learning work. In this chart, what you can see from the responding Chief Online Officers is whether they believe they have the determining or key responsibility, primary responsibility for each of these functions, or have a voice in them, are a contributing element to this process. And you can see that for almost everything on this list, there is close to, or in some cases even more than 90% of our respondents who felt that they were involved in these issues. And in terms of primary responsibility, more than 50% reported that they have that responsibility for the first 7 or 8 items on the list, down to strategic planning. So what we see here is that more than half of these online officers feel that they have the primary responsibility for online budgeting, for faculty training, for course design and development, and strategic planning. And for many of the other items on this list, their influence is almost as great. And for just about everything on the list, at least 70% of the respondents have some involvement. So you can look at that list yourselves and see just how broad the responsibilities of these emerging Chief Online Officers are. And this is, in fact, why our survey is focused on these individuals. It would be hard to find another campus officer, even including presidents and provosts, who would have the detailed grasp of this entire range of issues that we believe the Chief Online Officer has. One of the challenges of the survey is that we're looking for a specific person to respond at each institution, and not just a scattering of individuals throughout the structure of the institution. But in any case, we feel that the results we get have some additional credibility because of the role of the Chief Online Officer. Turning to course development, we asked several questions, and we followed up on those questions this year. The first one that we're seeing here is whether faculty are compensated for their involvement in course development. And of course, at most institutions, the faculty continue to play the critical role as subject matter experts, and in some cases, pedagogic experts as well, as we'll see. But it's interesting that looking at the full sample line about halfway down this chart, about 26% of institutions. A little over a quarter of the institutions responding report that they provide no extra compensation or incentives for faculty to engage in online course design and development. About 37%, so more than a third, report that they do typically pay online stipends for online course development. A few others, 4% provide other incentives that could include release time or computing equipment or assistance. But this is roughly about 40% on average. And then in between, there is a very significant percentage, about a third, where it varies from case to case to justify a stipend perhaps done during a time of the year when faculty are not in residence, or based on the need to develop courses rapidly to meet a demand or a gap in the curriculum. But in any case, it is an individual decision and not done across the board. It may also vary from department to department within an institution. The lack of payment where it exists, and it's greatest at public two-year institutions, perhaps for a lack of resources, but it may also in part point to the mainstreaming issue we mentioned before, that developing online courses is more and more becoming an expectation of faculty to move seamlessly from classroom instruction to online instruction, including the preparation of the materials. Another perspective on this is whether the institutions are providing instructional design support to faculty. And here, there are some striking patterns. For one thing, we can see that really more than 50% of institutions either provide no instructional design support or make it optional at the option usually of the instructor, of the faculty member. Again, it's in public two-year institutions where this trend is most extreme, and you see almost over 75% of public two-year institutions, community colleges, where faculty are on their own or seek the optional support that's available, and often it's optional because the staff resources are too small to guarantee that support or require that support for all course development. At the other end of the spectrum, large institutions seem to be requiring, that's the green part of the bar, requiring instructional design support, or the purple, the team approach. So more than 60% of large enrollment institutions are providing that support, which suggests that it's partly a question of resources. But the absence of instructional design support can have consequences. This year, we asked a few follow-up questions to try to measure those impacts, and we cross-related the responses here with questions about student engagement, course consistency, and the like. What we learned from that is that there is a clear correlation between the prevalence of instructional design and the amount of student-to-student interaction that chief online officers report at their institutions. On the left side of this graph are the institutions that report that they require instructional design support. and 69% of them report that there is lots of interaction in the courses that they build. On the other side of the chart, those institutions that report instructional design absent or optional, you can see that less than half report that there is lots of interaction in their courses, and there is some interaction actually in a larger proportion of their courses by the estimate of these chief online officers. So there's an interest in interaction, certainly, across the board, but instructional design presence seems to have a real impact. Then we looked at consistency in the use of the technology for online learning and in the pedagogy and design of courses. And again, what we found, the blue bar on this chart, where instructional design is required, there's relatively little technical variation among courses and departments. And and in terms of pedagogical diversity, although diversity seems from the right-hand side of the chart to be prevalent in terms of pedagogy throughout, nevertheless, the greatest tendency toward consistency in pedagogy is for those programs that do require instructional design support. Richard, I think the next chart is yours.
Thanks, Ron. So our final theme for this webinar is the question of innovation in online learning. There was a time when simply offering an online course or a program was by definition innovative, but I think now when we have tens of thousands of online courses and thousands of online programs, simply being online is taken for granted. It's a question of what do we do online? What are we trying to achieve? How do we judge that? We try to get a high-level read on how schools are thinking about relative innovation when it comes to online learning by asking them, just in simple high-level terms, their sense of recent distance traveled, the extent to which they'd made a lot of changes to their online technology or pedagogy or organization in recent years, and then looking ahead, are they contemplating major change, supplementary change, or really not much change? And again, we're not saying maximum change is the standard here. There can be lots of rationales for significant innovation or steady state or everywhere in between. But you can see there's a wide range of circumstances here. So the combination of both significant major change and significant anticipated change, only 10% of schools, that top right quadrant, not quadrant, top right cell, fall into that category. And very few schools say not much has changed and we don't anticipate much changing, only 6%. The most common answer was right in the middle. We've seen supplementary change and we expect supplementary change, but we're not contemplating anything dramatic. So very interesting sense of what is going on. And if you compare major change past to major change future, this would suggest 36% of schools said they saw major change in the past, but only 24% anticipated for the future. So does that actually suggest change is slowing down, which is contrary to all the noise we hear in the media about this new tool or this new process or this new company that projects itself as shaking up the industry somehow? Have we already arrived at something of a plateau when it comes to good quality functioning technology and approaches to pedagogy that seem to work reasonably well and have the backing of the majority of faculty? So an interesting perspective on relative change in this innovative but maturing industry. We also asked which types of schools are planning change by type of institution or by scale of online enrollment. And you can see, regardless of category, supplementary change is the norm. But definitely affinity between larger schools and public two-year schools most likely to anticipate major change in the next 2 to 3 years, which again goes back to that view of the largest players wanting to become larger, more dominant, really use online to change the game when it comes to higher education. And then public two-year schools perhaps embodying online as mainstream most emphatically, and therefore needing to really think about updating systems online as impacting the lives of the typical student rather than the exceptional student and everything that comes with that. Whereas smaller players may just be getting going, may think they've already done some heavy lifting to get where they are and need some breathing room before they anticipate anything more substantive. Next slide. This time around, we also asked about reasons to invest, in this case, in new technology in and around online learning. And we asked for a ranking of reasons. And here you're seeing the top reason, the second reason, and the third reason. Trying to increase student success emerged most strongly, particularly for the top reason. And I think that speaks to this sense of needing to ask tougher questions of online learning. It's not just about convenience and flexibility anymore. It's also about enabling students to finish the job and to ensure that students are not just checking boxes somehow, but are really being transformed as learners. Improving faculty experience emerged in aggregate second most cited reason, but you'll note that it was very rarely the top reason institutions cited, but more commonly a second or a third reason. The next two are interesting. A reason to invest in tech to solve technical problems, limitations with the functionality of existing tools. One example recently has been the tension between schools becoming interested in CBE, competency-based education, and what are seen as the traditional limitations of many, say, learning management systems or other tools that just didn't conceive of the kinds of movements and starting and ending points, the personalization that many CBE programs embody. The fourth one, experimentation, this idea of there's so much choice out there, so many tools and vendors touting for attention. How do I know what's appropriate, what works, what's a good fit, what fits with my strategy? So a sense of schools looking around and trying things out rather than saying, we believe in this as our next generation move and we're going to go with it. And then the rest you see diminish pretty significantly in terms of allegiance. And I'm always intrigued by lack of attention to competition. Few schools seeing technology as a way to stand out in a crowded market or keep up with the competition. It's still rare, I think, for schools online to trade on their particular tool set or the particular functionality of their offerings. Everything that they describe tends to be pretty common rather than unusual. And then seeking cost savings. Schools are not, again, perhaps counterintuitively, not seeing new technology as a way to save themselves money or save students money. Online is first and foremost, yes, access, and now perhaps student success, but saving anyone any money is much vaguer. Next slide. We try to get a sense of which particular, in this case, pedagogies, and then on the next slide, technologies, schools are considering moving into or experimenting with. We gave schools a lengthy list of prominent and other approaches and techniques. And I saw a question come in earlier on about badging and micro-credentials. That did emerge as the two the two tools or pedagogies of most interest. Nothing achieved even a majority of the sample in terms of interest or allegiance. There's a lot of fragmentation, experimentation going on here, a lot of overlap as well between different approaches. But I do see badging and micro-credentials as a logical extension of the convenience and flexibility of online learning now perhaps turning its attention to long traditional degree programs that might be sliced and diced in helpful, creative ways or laddered in some way or other. And then simulations and games, I think that sense of, can online learning move beyond, a rather text-heavy, threaded discussion dominant type model that works, but isn't necessarily that exciting or engaging? And is there a problematic gap between the way online has evolved in other industries, not least gaming and entertainment, where it's much more immersive and sort of personalized? And I think schools are interested in how might that be possible in a formal education environment, but I still think there are huge development and delivery challenges that are inhibiting that, but the interest is there. And then you see others, CBE, prior learning assessment, OER, and other things, but things like problem-based learning, which is a sort of a rare example of a named pedagogy, if you like, that has some currency, is hard to pin down. Is it already used? How does one know? How might it be implemented? How well is it possible in an online environment? What kind of online environment? So many questions arise there that I think that inhibits the extent to which schools are actively pursuing something based on its clarity and efficacy, as opposed to it's a piece of jargon and people aren't quite sure what to make of it and how to engage. And CBE on that slide, someone just asked, that's competency-based education. We asked the same kind of questions around new technologies under consideration, recognizing a lot of overlap between a pedagogy and a technology. They often are two sides of the same coin, so you'll see some similar phrasing here. We saw a little bit more enthusiasm here on the technical side versus the pedagogical side, a couple of options surpassing the 50% mark, adaptive learning and learning analytics, and we see those as both most likely to go mainstream. But again, a lot of variation in terms of what they mean. Are they being implemented in just a few courses as opposed to characterizing the entire program? You see simulations and games there again, virtual reality as a version of that. And even more traditional models like lecture and video capture still emerging as a horizon for some schools. So the same sense of lots of choice, lots of noise, hard to judge efficacy and fit, and as a result, a rather fragmented environment. So let's try and wrap up here with some final comments that summarize some of the things that we've been talking about. One theme we're keen to draw out is this question of delivery mode. The word online is thrown around as if it was a monolithic thing, when in fact there's a lot of variation and difference across different iterations of online learning. And again, what's a good strategic fit for whom, why, what discipline, what type of student? And then this whole blended learning question: should most schools be investing their energies in a blend of campus and online to ensure online serves core mission and core purpose and physical site, rather than the two going off at tangents? And is that consistent with the literature around efficacy in terms of student engagement and success? And also what we know at Eduventures from our surveys of prospective adult learners over the years, there's more and more appetite for some kind of blend. I think many adults are grasping towards wanting the best of online and the best of on ground, even if they can't quite articulate what that means in terms of a particular model. And I think there's a sense in which institutions have an opportunity for leadership here to articulate to the adult what might be a great blend, rather than waiting for adults to tell schools exactly what they want when they're perhaps in a weaker position to do so relative to institutions. Second bucket here is this emerging affinity between the largest schools online, their desire to become even larger by launching more programs, their exhibition of greater centralization of online functions, and is that therefore leading to more consistency, more quality, a better student experience? Or are they losing some of the idiosyncrasy, the nuances that individual faculty bring in a more bottom-up model that might trip them up over time? And then the interesting associations Ron pointed to between greater use of required instructional design support, and then self-reported, we will stress this, self-reported gains from chief online officers in terms of relative student interaction and the relative consistency of technology and pedagogy. And then finally, the theme of innovation. We do have this looming oversupply of online programs that might mean schools getting into the game more recently might not see the same returns as those that were earlier to market. And then what does that suggest about the need to innovate around this word online and start to make everything a little bit more about the nature of the online experience, not just the fact of the delivery mode? It's interesting that we see most chief online officers anticipating and reporting on supplementary change to their online technology and pedagogy rather than something more dramatic. So does that speak to stability and success, or does it speak to excessive noise and confusion about the next horizon, what to invest in, why to invest in it? So that's our summary at this point. Lots more you can read about in the Chloe 2 survey report, but let me hand back over to Ron to give you a heads up about what we're planning for the third Chloe survey.
Okay, and I'll be brief here because we do want to leave a few minutes to start answering questions. One major change or addition that we're delighted to announce is that Eric Fredrickson of the University of Rochester, the Associate Vice President for Online Learning there, and so a Chief Online Officer himself, will be collaborating with us on the Chloe 3 survey and report, and bringing in a perspective from his own pioneering studies on the role of the Chief Online Officer, the character of the position, as well as the background and interests of the people who are occupying these positions around the country. So we're excited about that. In terms of additional areas that we are planning to deal with, you see a list here. I'll just make a comment or two about a few of them. Clearly from a number of Richard's comments today, we have a continuing interest in blended learning, and we want to explore more fully whether there is a potential in structured blended learning that is not being realized, or how better to capture the simple growth of blended learning through the proliferation of courses versus programs. And we're going to be taking a closer look at institutions that are emphasizing course development over full program development. In terms of governance, we're going to try to look at it more as a process. And the same is true of the quality assurance activity at institutions. At this point, we've already looked at what some of the components are, but we want to start to see more how they fit together, and institutions can judge whether they have an efficient and working process from the data we hope to collect. In terms of the for-profit sector, again, something that we've commented on here in today's session, we do see them as continuing to have an important role in online learning. They still represent nearly a quarter of enrollment. And we think that in the past, they were leaders in terms of innovation, as well as having some problems that are probably familiar to everyone here. And the issues may well be how they adapt to new conditions and whether we see a resurgence or at least a continuance of for-profit online learning in the US. I do want to urge you one last time to consider getting your own institutions involved in the Chloe survey to make it more representative, more meaningful for your institutions. If you see yourself as the Chief Online Officer and have not been contacted about the third Chloe survey, please contact the email address listed at the bottom of this slide. And if not, please approach your chief online officer and make the case that it's valuable information that more than repays the time it takes to complete our survey. So thank you again for your presence here and your interest. And now we'll turn in the few minutes remaining to some questions that Barbara has been gathering.
Okay, I'm going to try to ask them very quickly. The first person asked, perhaps Ron will address this question. How does Chloe differ from Allen and Siemens' survey of online learning, the OLC and Babson research?
Well, I think the areas of emphasis are different. And the online learning Babson research has actually been evolving in the last year or two, and I don't think I can really comment on where it may be heading. But you should all recall that its main focus for many years was on the enrollment and growth issues, which have been now preempted in a way by IPEDS data extending into this arena. There's still a need for analysis, and we would look to the Babson group for some expertise in how to interpret. But we are trying to move more heavily into the functions that support online learning, the institutional organization factors, and the processes that may lead to success for online programs in the future and the segmenting of the market. So we think there's room for both, and we hope that we are probing into areas that have been relatively neglected in the past.
Okay, considering the emergence of alternative credentials, example, digital badges, verified credentials, have you considered including online alternative credential institutions as an institution type in your future research?
It's an interesting idea. Thus far, we've stuck with degree granting institutions, but I agree that line is an important one. I think the challenge is it's harder to come up with a comprehensive list. The motivations might be different. Comparing apples to apples can be challenging, but I do agree with you. It's a question in the background. Is the very institution offering online post-secondary education shifting, and therefore does Chloe need to be sensitive to that? So it's something we're conscious of.
Well, we actually do ask some questions related to this, but only where the non-traditional, non-degree awarding entity is working with an established institution. And in the third Chloe survey, there are some specific questions about partnerships that are developing between institutions that are accredited higher education providers and these new providers. And we'll see what comes out of that. This is certainly an area we could explore in the future. But again, the focus is likely to be through the experience of traditional institutions in working with those companies and not specifically those companies themselves.
Okay, I'm gonna make this the last question since we are right at time here. What are some sample titles for the Chief Online Officer? Example, could this be the provost, or is this a dedicated position?
Well, in a small institution, the provost or even the president may be handling these matters directly. But what we're finding from the respondents, and remember there were over 180 of them, is that they typically have report lines in the academic affairs part of the institution. About 75% of them have academic affairs related titles. Their titles as assistant and associate vice president, vice provost, dean titles very often. and then they characterize their scope with a wide range of issues: distance learning, online learning, student engagement. Some use the term innovation in their titles, that they have a mandate to deal with innovation. But in the report, you will see a list which extends to between 25 and 30 different titles that we captured in our Chloe 2 survey.
Okay, at this point, I would just like to thank our presenters for today and all our attendees. We will be following up with an email to you on the 3rd of May that'll include the recording. And I would like to mention that we will be having another research webinar for Quality Matters at some point later on in July that will have to do with the 6th edition of the Quality Matters rubric and the research that was a part of the process in developing it. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.